With the debut of Hideo Kojima's Death Stranding in 2019, the newly reformed Kojima Productions also revealed its new mascot and modus operandi to be something called Ludens. But apart from the company's spaceman icon and its slogan, "From Sapiens to Ludens," what exactly is Ludens? And how does it connect generally with not only Death Stranding, but the essential quality of all Hideo Kojima games? Let's find out. It was in 1938, on the precipice of the Second World War, that the Dutch cultural theorist Johan Huizinga wrote Homo Ludens, Study of the Play Element in Culture. The book argued against the conventional definition of humanity as Homo sapiens, or wise humans. Huizinga believed that this name came loaded with assumptions from its era of origin, the Age of Reason, the 18th century. Rather than Homo sapiens or Homo faber, man the maker, Huizinga concluded that what really sets us apart from other species is a word roughly translated as play. We are, for Huizinga, Homo Ludens. By Ludens, Huizinga did not only mean play as the English word sometimes is used, play as mere frivolity. Huizinga included the wide expanse of all human culture and intellectual pursuit in the term Ludens. He argued that play is what fundamentally defines us, that play is inherent to human nature, from our languages to our creation of all cultures. For Huizinga, civilization itself is a byproduct of play, as is religion, art, politics, and everything else that defines being human. And play is so special because it has no purpose, no explanation, no value or ultimate inherent meaning other than itself. Huizinga argued that play is proof that we're more than only rational beings because play is irrational. If we were just, as modern science insists, meat robots, why then would we feel so driven to create games and have fun? For Huizinga, play is quintessentially human because it allows us to impose order and perfection, however limited, on an inherently imperfect world. Play lets us briefly live in a world more suited to our minds, which, after all, crave stimulation and enjoyment and tension, all derived from rules and systems that exist entirely outside ordinary reality. You might think to say all of humanity's mental life consisting of games is somehow negative, that this is just a version of Shakespeare's "all of life's but a stage and we are merely players." But this isn't Huizinga's point of view. To the contrary, for him, play is what gives life its genuine sense of meaning, its value for human beings. Without play and imagination, there would be no society, no civilizations. Life would have no meaning for Huizinga, and we'd be as good as dead. It's through the spark of play and fun as social activities that we humans have anything of our own, that we can truly be called free beings. That might be one of the most radical aspects of Huizinga's thesis, that we need other human beings to survive, to truly live our lives. Although it's of course entirely consistent with biology and anthropology. Now, since I've posited that all culture is in some sense a form of play, clearly that covers more than just Hideo Kojima. All video games, let alone all creative works, are versions of Huizinga's notion of the transformative, even transcendental properties of play. So what makes Kojima's games in particular especially Huizingarian? Well, before Kojima, in my view, roughly, video games were one of two things. You had games that totally departed from the real world, like Mario. Asking questions like, why do mushrooms make you big, why are turtles the bad guys, and why am I a plumber? Well, because Mario is completely detached from reality, these questions are pointless. And everyone sort of knows that, entering into a sort of unspoken contract simply by playing the game. Then, on the other hand, you had games that tried the opposite, to put you in a state of pseudo or hyper-realism. Here, I think of Yu Suzuki's seminal work in the 80s for Sega. Games like Hang On or Outrun were still obviously colorful cartoon worlds, but they adhered much more so than Mario to a logic that reminded you of reality. Projecting a more convincing, more grounded version of the real world was their entire selling point. With me so far? Well, Kojima's games, I'd say, combine these two formats. And they do so precisely to make the same point as Huizinga. The line between, as Huizinga wrote, play and the seriousness of play is always fluid. In Kojima's games, the same fluidity we find between versions of reality and escapades away from it. In MGS1, some of the weapons are totally realistic, while others are more embellished. Kojima explained in the game's official mission handbook that the dev team made 2/3 of the weapons real and 1/3 unreal. It all depended essentially on what would be the most fun. The same is of course true of the central scenario in every MGS, of a solo infiltration. In reality, operators never sneak alone. The thrilling tension and excitement of MGS's stealth operations isn't based on real-life espionage at all. It's based on that classic kids game, hide and seek.
遊びがありまして、今の子供はあまりやってないと思うんですけども、非常にこう友達と役割分担する、ことでですね、一転してこう逆転の立場になるんですよ。で、その辺の緊張感というのが非常に面白くて。今もそうですけど、子供とかくれんぼはよくやるんですけど、非常に好きな遊びですね。どこでもできて、手軽な面白いゲームというか。
The same general ludic approach was also on display in this interview with IGN about Metal Gear Solid V: The Phantom Pain, when Kojima explained why some of the technology, including the Metal Gear Sahelanthropus, is far more futuristic in the game than was possible in the year of its setting, 1984.
To be honest, I never set out to create a franchise called Metal Gear, and the original game actually had a different title at first. However, various factors at the time led us to name the game after the main enemy weapon. Once you do that, there's no turning back. You can't make a Metal Gear without honoring the title, so it goes without saying that the Phantom Pain will feature some new incarnation of the bipedal walking tank. However, since the Phantom Pain takes place in 1984, the designs are influenced by popular sci-fi movies from the era. You'll see a lot of technology that didn't really exist back then. Certain aspects are realistic, but when it comes to high-tech weapons and walking tanks, what you're seeing are visions of the future through the lens of that era. We also drew inspiration from failed 80s military R&D projects that never panned out. Hopefully, people will appreciate those details and the unique atmosphere of sci-fi circa 1984.
When the same game that involves rules, all centered on pseudo-realistically sneaking through an enemy stronghold, also features characters and scenarios totally outside the bounds of reality, like giant killer robots, vampires, and so on, it seems to pose a fundamental question over whether the so-called real world and the worlds of play that we willingly imagine are so distinct after all. By doing this blending together, Kojima has, throughout his entire career, I'd argue, been able to use games to comment on the real world and merge their function on a social and cultural level with that of narrative-based art forms like novels or movies. Yet unlike many of the creators of so-called cinematic games or visual novels, this blend across purposes between, say, narrative and gameplay allows his games, since the very beginning, to still be extremely fun as not only story scenarios, but as games. I think that's because in Kojima's games, story and gameplay are one in the same. The gameplay isn't merely a vehicle for the story, or in any sort of conflict with it. To the contrary, gameplay in Kojima's games is the story, and vice versa. What I'm getting at is Kojima's games are always games on multiple levels. Apart from the core mechanics and design, they're also games in terms of how they comment on, depict, or reflect culture. Both certain cultures in particular, but also culture as such, culture in general. Kojima's games build themselves as networks, as constellations of meaning. They put together things that were separate before. The game is played by first making the right underlying connections, then by figuring out the underlying message, and then deciding how to apply the message or theme to our own lives for ourselves. In a 1996 interview on Policenauts, Kojima directly compared this metagame that I'm describing to a game of catch. He throws the ball, and it's up to players to catch it. Nearly everything in a Hideo Kojima game plays some purpose towards the overall theme. That's why his creations are so uniquely ludic. For the most part, an idea or scenario is only implemented if it serves the title's central ideas, all as part of one grand game. He said to The Guardian that, for example, the system in Death Stranding of balancing and shouldering burdens is about conveying through gameplay the importance of our natural-born duty of care to others. The many mysteries of 2015's The Phantom Pain, meanwhile, convey again through interaction the difficulties of separating truth from perception, especially in the modern information age. Perhaps the ultimate example of Kojima's ludic style is Metal Gear itself. Though the giant bipedal robot is obviously unreal, and we could draw comparisons between it and many other robots from popular culture, Kojima typically uses it to convey a very real philosophy of anti-proliferation and pacifism. But we've only covered now half of what makes Kojima's games examples of the Ludens concept. To truly see the relevance of Huizinga to Kojima's work all along, we'd have to also mention that, for Huizinga, games are inherently social, as I said before. That's why he thought they provide the basis for culture and civilization, which, after all, are impossible with only one person, much like most games. Ironically, Kojima's games are typically made for a single player, though, but that's part of why I'd argue that they tend to be so referential. Kojima's games plug the individual in to a wider society. Every Kojima game makes you think about issues on a cultural, sometimes even global scale, like nuclear proliferation, whether or not humanity will enter space, and how war in the 21st century has changed. Kojima's games teach you or signal to you the common vernacular, the cultural language that you and Kojima can share, simply by sharing in his game.
Are you familiar with the film 2001: A Space Odyssey?
Huizinga argued this inclusivity within an almost secret and thereby somewhat exclusive order, defined as it is by rules that only the players know, was a key component to human games. The fact you and I are playing a made-up game that only we and the other players know the rules for gives it an almost conspiratorial character. The same, in a subtle way, is also true of any particular culture, and therein emerges conflicts between them, I suppose. Knowing the rules, the lingo, the shared cache of cultural references, that distinguishes, as it were, one of us from one of them. This, Huizinga explains, is part of why games tend to rely on pretend, or masks and disguises, on the interplay between knowing it's a game and taking it seriously. Now, at first you might think Kojima, a creator known for his fourth wall breaks and subverting expectations, isn't really much of a team player. But the opposite, I'd say, is true. The whole point of how Kojima uses fourth wall breaks and meta commentary is precisely to acknowledge what only he and the players truly know, understand, and share. Knowing that this is a game, a perfectly unreal, temporary world apart from the actual one, and yet in turn that the actual one is one that we experience and live through no less imaginatively than the process that we undergo while playing his game. Breaking the fourth wall, in theory, shouldn't work in a game. By proving it nonetheless does in video games, again, Kojima seems to have made a tradition out of using games to point out we in our everyday lives are engaged in games of our own design. The distinction between those games we know aren't real, like his, and the ones we pretend are, the ones we live in our everyday life as we go about the business of culture and society, that distinction isn't as clear-cut as you might first assume. That's why, ironically, if anything, when Kojima breaks the fourth wall, notice it doesn't diminish the power or immersion in his game world at all. It greatly strengthens it. Where does the game end and real reality begin? We can't really say, and that, in turn, says a lot about human beings as Homo Ludens. But lastly, there was the other major Huizingerian component to Kojima's games: the many links and connections, or strands, they self-consciously form with other fictional or game-based worlds, including made-up organizations and facets of culture taken from the real world. This too is a form of dress-up and disguises, of games as a series of repetitions and alterations. Each of his games isn't an island. They connect in some way or another, playfully, with outside works or reference points from even the real world. The original Metal Gear on the MSX2, for example, borrowed names from animals like Snake and Gray Fox. Some of its bosses were from real-world agencies or outfits like GSG-9 and the SAS. There were androids in the game, and nods to the French Resistance. One support character used to sing in a punk band, and the game even took place in a fictional city inside South Africa. These connections to wider facets of society and culture, both real and imagined, are all examples of play, in Huizinga's sense. They are byproducts of Kojima's playful imagination. They're interpretations of our world. They follow a certain set of rules, and even though it's obvious that this colorful interpretation of reality isn't real, by playing Metal Gear, on some level we enjoy pretending to take it seriously. So much so that the line starts to blur between whether it's really pretend. It is imaginary, yet it has meaning. That, to some extent, is the essence of the Ludens concept. Some have criticized Kojima's games for being too referential. The localizer for MGS2 once complained, for example, that the script, which flatly referenced famous movie scenes, could never be a work of true art. But I claim this ideal of the artist as a secluded hermit painting on the mountaintop from the purity of their imagination is somewhat old-fashioned. The idea of human beings as atomized, discrete individuals ignores the pervading role today that modern culture, in the information age, plays in shaping one's sense of self. This is directly conveyed by all the references in Kojima's games. When we see a lone operative sneaking into enemy territory, our minds playfully conjure up similar cultural shapes and figures like, say, James Bond or the famous British SAS. When we think of a story about a large sea vessel wrecking, it's fun, almost irresistibly so, to think in turn of the Titanic. Language and thinking themselves are rule-bound systems of interrelations among non-identical things. That's the inherent fun of imagination, and in thinking generally. We playfully compare things, develop connections and meanings that may or may not really objectively exist. Kojima, on some level or another, seems to have grasped this crucial play element about human nature throughout his career. Play is culture. As his games show us, play is the substance, the very substance, of human meaning. Even the infamous Kojima fourth wall breaks and meta-commentary speak to this point. Sometimes breaking the rules of previous games can itself be a version of play. MGS2, for example, broke the rule of making a snake by providing us merely a form of snake, Raiden, without the substance. By MGS3, connections to outside works and points of reference were added to by connections to prior Kojima games. Of course, even going back to Snatcher and Police Knots in the 90s, there were cameos and Easter eggs taken from other Kojima games. But MGS3 took this kind of meta play to new levels. Ironically, though story-wise Snake is actually a duplicate of Big Boss, for players the opposite was true. The Big Boss we play as in MGS3 was just another version of Snake from the earlier games. That's the kind of play I'm talking about. One of an active imagination, one that establishes rules, often only to playfully subvert them. It's not, strictly speaking, rational. It's a demonstration, in fact, of why Huizinga thought we were no Homo sapiens at all, but rather Homo Ludens. Our minds seem to be preternaturally disposed towards this sort of ritualism and playful forms of recursive subjective interpretation. It's fun to notice the end's parrot is just like EE's, or how similarly the fear moves to vamp, or how Volgan quotes Liquid Snake. This series of interrelations and the interplay therein is what defines culture. Kojima's games are merely echoing the same internal logic, you might say as their own form of play acting. I'd argue that while every Kojima game has demonstrated the Ludens idea, it wasn't really crucial until MGS-V: The Phantom Pain. This game expanded the network, if you will, of playful interrelations and possible interpretations as to become all but entirely a contingent byproduct of the individual player's imagination. The game of figuring the Phantom Pain out can go on indefinitely. It will, on some level, truly never be game over. And then of course you have Kojima's most recent game, and the first to explicitly conjure the Ludens meme, Death Stranding. Take the songs in Death Stranding. Some were written about the game's themes, while others weren't. Either way, they all pack an emotional punch and a sense of relevancy by seeming to speak to the game, simply because they play at the same time that we are playing it. The Ludens concept also helps explain the presence of BB. For Huizinga, child's play epitomizes our nature as Homo Ludens. He believed the playfulness and inventive imagination, so readily apparent in infants and young children, is something we carry with us well into adulthood, for as long as we remain truly alive. In Death Stranding, BB serves as a cipher for your inner child. To take care of him is one and the same as taking care of yourself. Much of Death Stranding isn't depicted on screen, but rather left to the free play of your imagination. Connections to other games, albums, movies, and even motorcycles are made explicit in a collectible, gamified format. Meanwhile, we have a new type of fourth wall breaking in Death Stranding. References that are being made to the careers of the actors in the game. The scene with Fragile and Higgs, for example, seems to my mind to echo the real story of Léa Seydoux's mistreatment during the film Blue is the Warmest Color. And Léa Seydoux herself, of course, is literally a Bond girl. The model for Deadman and Hartman are both directors. The net, it seems, arches ever wider in terms of all the interconnections and interrelations that we can draw. Now both of their bodies of work have potential relevance to Death Stranding. The character Higgs, meanwhile, echoes Ocelot by using the same voice actor that played him in The Phantom Pain, Troy Baker. Sam and Cliff's relationship echoes that between Snake and Big Boss. In many respects, Death Stranding was the first Hideo Kojima game where characters resembling other characters from prior titles was such a big focus, barring of course maybe Snake Eater. Hopefully I've made it at least a little clear what it means to be a Ludens, and how every Kojima game to some extent or another exemplifies the very aspects of human nature and culture that Huizinga was trying to describe. Who knows what ways our imaginations will be sparked and our culture commented on or reflected playfully by Kojima's next game. I can't wait to find out together. Until next time, boss.